All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am McKenna Sturgeon, CML's Training and Marketing Specialist. I am joined today by some of our CML team. Jacqueline is the lobbyist that worked on Kratom. We're also joined by Eric from CCI, and then we've got the American Kratom Association and the Colorado Association of Local Public Health Officials to chat with us about what Kratom is. I'm really excited about this and what I'm going to learn. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and you will get a link to both the recording and the presentation materials after the webinar. So stay tuned for that. You can also ask questions in the little box that's going to be to the right of your screen. There's a questions section there. Please type those in and we will go ahead and moderate those at the end of this webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to Jacqueline to get us started.
Thanks, McKenna, and thank you all for joining us today. Again, my name is Jacqueline Turway. I am the Legislative and Policy Advocate for CML, and one of my issue areas includes Kratom. So thanks again for joining us. What we're going to start out with is discussing Senate Bill 120, which came through the state legislature this year, and what that deals with and what that looks like moving forward. So I have with me Eric Bergman from CCI, if you want to introduce yourself and then kind of discuss the first part of Senate Bill 120.
Sure, thank you, Jacqueline. I'm Eric Bergman. I'm the Policy Director for Colorado Counties Incorporated. We are if you're not familiar with CCI, we are the statewide association of counties. We represent 61 of the 64 counties in the state. Doing advocacy work at the General Assembly and a lot of education work, such as this webinar that we're all in today. I do want to thank Jacqueline and CalFO and the Kratom Association for being with us today and on this webinar. We had a lot of questions during the course of this session. For a lot of my members, I can say definitively that many of them had never heard of Kratom before. I know I've just seen it, in signs in some of the storefronts and stuff, and so there was a huge learning curve for myself and for a lot of our members. As the bill was introduced, it was actually more of a regulatory framework to regulate Kratom production and sale in Colorado. But as it went through the process, it actually morphed into more of a study with a few key components that will go into effect this year that Jacqueline will cover. I will say that this bill also went down to the very last day of, I think the very last day of session, as far as amendments and changes, and again, we are very much indebted to Jacqueline Turway for her work on the bill as it was going through the last final hours and getting it into the shape that it's in now. So one of the key components of the bill, as I said before, it started out as more of a regulatory oversight of this product, but then it changed into more of a feasibility study that the Department of Revenue is undertaking this summer. They're charged with providing that report back to the General Assembly by January of next year, and then hope with an eye towards maybe further legislation in the next session. But as far as the feasibility study itself, you can see from the next slide here that it is supposed to basically cover what is an adequate level of regulation for Kratom products, for Kratom processors and Kratom retailers, deciding what the appropriate state agency. During the course of the session, obviously Revenue is conducting the study, but Department of Public Health and Environment was chiming in, and so I think part of what they'll be looking at this summer is what is the appropriate agency to oversee Kratom. They're going to have to define terms such as processing, selling, advertising Kratom and Kratom products. Things like age restrictions and underage compliance checks and how that will be handled and by who. Kratom testing, similar to what we do with marijuana testing in the state. One of the big issues that came up during the session that CalFO had raised was the use of Kratom in food products, mixing it with other things, and that was one of the big points of discussion in the legislation. That'll be studied over the summer and fall. Things like labeling requirements on different products, adverse health reporting, how that will happen and who they report to, and then finally fiscal considerations and reporting requirements for the industry and for sellers. as we go through as well. So it's a fairly comprehensive study that'll be conducted over the course of the rest of this year. I believe we have a member from CalFO. There's the study group itself is pretty diverse, that's working with Department of Revenue on putting this study together. And so we look forward to what comes out of that study, and obviously it'll be guiding additional future conversations next session. So with that, I guess we can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it back to my colleague, Jacqueline Turvey. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And one thing to point out too on that group for the feasibility study, CML is participating on that, and I believe CCI is participating as well. So we are going to make sure that our local voices are heard in that process as well. So just want to make sure you guys are aware of that. One of the conversations that was had was that in case something doesn't come out of the feasibility study, we wanted to make sure that there was some sort of backstop as far as regulations. So that's what this first bullet is, the effective July 1st of 2024, in case nothing comes of the feasibility report, no legislation or something like that. So no adulterated products, meaning that there's no products that have fentanyl or other substances added to Kratom. And then labeling requirements showing the identity and address of the manufacturer and the full list of ingredients on the label. And then also a 21 and up age restriction effective July 1st of 2024. So that gives them the opportunity to look at the feasibility report in January of 2023, have the entire 2023 legislative session to possibly pass something, and also the entire 2024 legislative session to possibly pass things based off of the feasibility report as well. In addition, effective August 10th of this year, there was a 21 and up age restriction put in place, meaning that you cannot sell to anyone below the age of 21, with civil penalties with $200 fine for an underage sale put into the legislation. So that again is effective now. It went into effect August 10th of this year. We also worked really hard with our friends over at CCI to ensure that statutory or home rule municipalities, counties, or city and counties may enact stricter ordinances should they choose to, anything stricter than a 21 and up age restriction or any other ordinances as well. So that is in the bill that was effective August 10th of this year as well. So the next slide, please. Just wanted to give an overview. There are a few that have local regulations that have been in effect already. There are two that have the sale of Kratom banned currently. That is Parker and Monument. Denver has some very strict labeling requirements for their packaging, and also does not allow you to give recommendations as far as the amount of usage of the product. And then further, Castle Rocks does have an age restriction, but their age restriction was 18 and up. So that's why it has the asterisk there, is because, you know, it's no longer necessarily in effect since the age restriction is now 21 and up. Theirs was an 18 and up. So now everyone is 21 and up. It's no longer in effect, but they did have an age restriction in Castle Rock. So now I'm going to pass the presentation over to our friends over at the American Kratom Association.
Thank you, Jacqueline. My name is Matt Caddo. I'm the Senior Fellow in Public Policy with the American Kratom Association. I'm actually at an airport lounge right now. I apologize for the backdrop. I live my life going from one plane to another. My wife says that when people ask my address, I should say it's the nearest Marriott hotel. But I'm actively involved in discussions around the country about Kratom, so I welcome this opportunity. The question, what is Kratom? It's a plant that's grown in Southeast Asia. It's indigenous there. It has been used for centuries there safely by the indigenous populations. And it is something that came to the the plant and the products associated with it came to the United States just after the Vietnamese War, mainly by our soldiers who brought it home because they had picked the leaves, chewed on them as they were in the hot jungles during the war, and they found that the energy boost and the increased focus was very valuable to them. And so they self-imported it back to the United States. And then just after the Vietnam War, we had a significant increase in the Hmong population immigrating to the United States, and the Hmong populations have used kratom in their diet for many, many centuries. So that's how it first got introduced. It percolated along in the United States until the early 90s, when it became of interest to smoke shops and tobacco shops. And some amateur alchemists decided to experiment with it, and that led to what we now have today with problems with adulterated kratom products. One of the issues of controversy is what kratom shots, and are they safe? And that's on the next slide here. And this is a very interesting question, because the truth is that these extract shot products are actually more purified than the natural plant itself, and they're more standardized. And so there's an argument to be made that they're actually safer, even though they get demonized often as the gas station drug because of where they're sold. And the only reason that you don't see these kratom shots and other kratom powder and capsule and pills sold in big box stores or on Amazon is because of the demonization that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has been engaged in with kratom. And I'll explain that in just a second. I mean, we all want to trust the FDA, but unfortunately, with respect to dietary supplements, and particularly with kratom, they have not earned the trust of the American people. And that's an important part of the discussion, I think, as we go through this slide deck. On the next slide, the question is, should kratom be banned? Because it always comes down to whether we should ban it or regulate it. Our organization represents consumers. There are some 15 million American consumers that regularly use kratom products, and depending on the use they put to it, at higher doses of the kratom product as they go along. But this question about whether kratom should be banned was introduced by the Food and Drug Administration at multiple levels. They first, in 2016, went to the DEA and asked them to schedule under the Controlled Substances Act criteria using what's called the Emergency Powers section. For the first time, you go to the next slide, the first time in the history of the Controlled Substances Act where a published notice of a scheduling decision was withdrawn. And that withdrawal occurred actually on October 13th, 2016. And they asked the FDA to provide additional information. They set a deadline for it. That deadline was December 1st of 2016. They asked for what's called a full 8-factor analysis. They invited public comment. There were 147,000 people who signed a petition not to saying don't ban kratom that was posted to the We the People White House platform. And there were 23,236 public comments, 99.1% of which were opposed to the ban on kratom. The DEA withdrew and then failed to act on pursuing it because the FDA did not produce the 8-factor analysis that they had asked for by the December 1st deadline. The FDA did, however, if we'll go to the next slide, submit an 8-factor analysis in October of 2017. And after a complete and exhaustive comprehensive evaluation of the application made by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to ban kratom, the Assistant Secretary for Health, Dr. Brett Chua, determined that he would withdraw that application so that it's no longer formally under consideration by the Drug Enforcement Administration. And he characterized the scientific package that had been presented by the FDA as being embarrassingly poor evidence and data, and failed to consider the overall public health. And the overall public health is important because we know from research that is conducted, more than 100 studies that have been added to the body of scientific evidence since Dr. Chua made his decision, that indicates that kratom can be very beneficial to people for their health and well-being, particularly people that are struggling with acute and chronic pain. That led to a decision in the next slide by the Secretary of HHS, Xavier Becerra, where he, in response to a congressional inquiry from Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Congressman Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, asking about the agency's position on kratom and whether it should be scheduled, Secretary Becerra acknowledged that there are significant knowledge gaps that exist that have to be closed through research. He acknowledged that on the safety profile of kratom, that all of the information at the FDA had been circulated, that actually the data showed that many of these kratom-involved overdose deaths had been reported occurred after the use of adulterated kratom products or taking kratom with other substances. In fact, there's not been a single documented case where kratom alone was the cause of the death. And it's interesting that in Colorado, there was a report of about 14 deaths that were associated with kratom, and a subsequent evaluation that was done by Colorado researchers and published in a commentary in the New England Journal of Medicine indicated that when those test results or those conclusions by medical examiner coroners were subjected to more intense scrutiny with sophisticated analytical tools and more modern equipment, they determined that none of them were kratom only. In fact, they were all polydrug use, and only one of those deaths did not have a sufficient blood sample in order to make an evaluation as to what the cause of the death was. But as you see on the next slide, the National Institute on Drug Abuse that originally supported the FDA's position on kratom has reversed that. And Dr. Nora Volkow, in testimony before the Congress, and that has led Congress consistently in report language to call for kratom to be accessible to the public, says that kratom, when sold as a tea, has effects that are similar to a dose of buprenorphine, and it's a safe and effective treatment for opioid use disorder. And that's what we're finding more and more, is that people that struggle with acute and chronic pain are successfully able to wean off of opioids along the way. Now, the FDA did not finish with their battle here in the United States. They actually went, as evidence in the next slide, to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in 2021 and asked the UN Commission to add kratom to the international scheduling, which has a much lower standard for the criteria. Typically, those reviews are assigned to the World Health Organization, to the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, and they ruled on December 1st of 2021 there was insufficient evidence to even recommend a critical review, which would have been a year-long review by international scientists. There wasn't even sufficient evidence to do that. And so I think that the key point here is that we now have a substantial body of scientific evidence that indicates that kratom should continue to be researched and studied, but it is safe for people to actually have accessibility to it. The fiscal year 2023 appropriations bill, as shown in the next slide, indicates that or recognizes the potential promising results of kratom for acute and chronic pain patients, and how that can be an alternative to sometimes dangerously addictive and potentially deadly prescription opioids. And that being a harm reduction measure is driving NIDA's research. On the next slide, the leading scientist in the NIDA contracting is Dr. Christopher McCurdy, and he's been at this actually from the early 1990s in researching kratom. He's world renowned for his work here, and his conclusion is that even at very high dose levels of kratom, that kratom was very safe and did not affect respiration or coordination. And that, of course, is the key to the safety issue. If you have kratom that is suppressing the respiratory system of an individual, as the standard profile for opioids, you have overdose deaths that suffocate the consumer. In this case, that doesn't happen. Kratom has a very unique effect on the alkaloids and the mu-opioid receptor in the brain, and they're called partial agonists. They don't travel to the respiratory system in any significant way. And so that's very important when we look at the safety profile of kratom. The next slide shows the results of work by Dr. Garcia Romeo from Johns Hopkins University, where they looked at adult kratom user populations, analyzed the reported effects of kratom that was being used for acute and chronic pain patients, and they found that 87% reported relief from withdrawal symptoms, which, as we all know, is the biggest problem of people getting off of opioid addictions that lead to, in many cases, overdose deaths. 35% were free from opioids within a year using kratom as the replacement product. So this is a critical issue on the safety profile, but the outstanding issue here is whether or not kratom is dangerously addictive. And you look to the next slide, it reports on 2 studies that were done by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. These are animal studies that are done. These are the gold standard for assessing the addiction liability and whether any substance qualifies for scheduling under the Controlled Substances Act. The first HEMB study concluded that, in fact, not only was there not an abuse potential or addiction liability, the kratom reduced the morphine intake, which was the reference drug they used in the study. And that, of course, is a desired characteristic for any pharmacotherapy that might be used in getting people to wean off opiate addictions. The next study that was done by NIDA was called the U study, and there they found that there was limited abuse liability for metrogene, the principal alkaloid in kratom, and there was potential for metrogene treatment to specifically reduce opioid abuse. This is why there's such a great interest at the federal level by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, accepted with funding from the Congress, in order to research and study kratom for that potential benefit. But it always comes down to the question is kratom safe and how can we do it? And we have seen from the research that the problem is adulterated products. And we are not as a public policy mechanism in the business of banning products when they're adulterated. The next slide shows you what common food products, and there are a number of these. Honey can be adulterated, and there are occasions where the FDA has to step in and actually look at honey adulteration and whether or not there has to be targeted removals from the marketplace of adulterated products. There was actually a study done, as shown on the next slide, the toxic impact of honey adulteration, in a review of it, because there are side effects when someone adulterate. And by the way, most of the bad actors in the adulteration space of any substance are looking to do one thing, and that is to enhance their economic bottom line. They want to give the product an enhanced effect, and that's what they do with honey. It's what they do with kratom, and that's why they have to be regulated as closely as possible. Another common food product that has been adulterated is red chili powder. And here we find that there are many instances where that kind of work that was done, the adulterants include Sudan red brick powder, grit, sand, dirt, non-permitted color, sawdust. All of that leads to adverse effects and potentially can be carcinogenic with the Sudan dye. And all of it, again, is designed to enhance the economic power. Another very common consumer product that's subject to adulteration is milk. And if you look on this next slide, it shows you the common kind of adulterants. They add water to it to increase the milk volume and increase their obvious economic benefit, but it decreases the nutritive value and poses health hazard for infants, particularly when you water down milk. They add other substances, detergents, urea, other things, all of which can have significant adverse effects. And the key here is that we are not in the business as a public policy of trying to ban products because they are subject to adulteration by bad actors. And kratom is exactly what happened. On the next slide, you'll see that there was a product that really got the attention of the FDA in 2014, when there were 9 deaths that were associated with a powdered kratom product in Sweden in a 12-month period. And the argument there was that kratom was the cause. Krypton is a powdered kratom product. When a review was done, as shown on the next slide, by the Swedish scientists, they found that all 9 of those deaths were actually caused by the intoxication of and adding of O-desmethyltramadol to the powdered kratom product, and that's what contributed to these unintentional death of these 9 cases. It wasn't kratom at all. Yet the FDA includes these 9 deaths in every one of their scientific assessments about the potential safety risk of kratom. It's not appropriate, it shouldn't be done, and yet that's what was done in 2009 when they actually did this, when those deaths occurred, in 2011 when the review was done. So there are other examples of this. The next slide shows something that has been evident, which is a big concern to us as a consumer organization. In 2016, there was a review of adulteration for commercial kratom products that had elevated 7-hydroxymetrogenine, which is one of the 2 suspect alkaloids the FDA has targeted with kratom. 7-hydroxymetrogenine is a metabolite. It's not inherent to the plant itself, but it's a metabolite of the plant. And some of these bad actors actually synthesized 7-hydroxymetrogenine and added it to commercial kratom products in order to enhance the effects, which included very dangerous effects, because 7-hydroxymetrogenine in a concentrated form like that is more powerful, by 13 times more powerful than heroin. Other studies have shown, in the next slide, that these adulterants, and this is a recent study just published back in March, that showed there was acute renal insufficiency associated with the consumption of hydrocodone and morphine adulterated kratom. This illustrates why regulation is critically important and why we came to the Colorado legislature to ask them to do what 7 other states have done, well, 6 other states other than Colorado, which is Utah, Arizona, Georgia, Oregon, Nevada, and Oklahoma. All have instituted the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, and this final slide kind of outlines what we're hopeful that the Colorado legislature will, after their review and after the research is done by the Department of Revenue, that they will restrict the sale of any kratom product that's adulterated with any of these substances, and there's a standard that you can apply to it. There would be no synthetic kratom alkaloids that would enhance the effect of the product, that no kratom extract can use a residual solvent for the extraction process that is higher than allowed by the USP for food products. That's an important standard. No kratom containing 7-hydroxymetrogenine in an alkaloid fraction greater than 2% of the natural plant product would be allowed, and no kratom product that is not labeled with ingredients and directions for use and makes no illegal therapeutic claims and identifies the manufacturer, so that if there is an adverse event, it is easy then to go back and identify where that manufacturer has produced their product and to shut them down. And then we advocate no sales to minors under the age of 21, or we prefer 18, because we found that there are many people, young people, that are trapped in that addiction cycle that are over 18, between 18 and 21. So I think that's worthy of consideration. We believe strongly in good regulatory practices here. We wish the Food and Drug Administration would do what they're supposed to do under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But just to conclude with one example of why they will not do it. Over the past 2 years, the American Kratom Association has reported more than 60 Kratom vendors for making blatantly illegal marketing claims, claiming therapeutic benefits on their marketing and labeling materials, selling Kratom products to consumers. We reported those 60 plus companies. It was only a month ago that they finally came out and issued a warning letter, which is the mildest form of enforcement available to them, to 3 of those 64 companies that we reported. We are now going to go back, and we've gone back and reviewed all 64. We found that there are 49 of those companies that are still engaged in illegal marketing practices that mislead consumers. We're in the business of trying to regulate Kratom responsibly. We want to protect consumers, and we're hopeful that Colorado will adopt this regulatory regimen that really will benefit the consumers in the state of Colorado. And we look forward to working with each of you in getting to the right conclusion on these matters. So I thank you for this opportunity to have this discussion, and we welcome any questions that might come from at the end of the webinar here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And then we will move to the Colorado Association of Local Public Health Officials. Kara?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Thank you for having me. My name is Kara Bradbury. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Association of Local Public Health Officials. Our organization is a member-based organization, and we represent all currently 54, soon to be more, local public health agencies in the state of Colorado. Similar to CCI, this topic of Kratom has been somewhat of a steep learning curve over the last year, or half a year. And so what I really am going to talk about today is just everything that we discussed as a policy committee and where we sort of landed in things that we believe are true or concerns that we have about Kratom regulation. I will say, however, that the topic is not entirely new to local public health. There were efforts prior to the COVID pandemic back in 2019 by the Kratom Association to advance regulation in Colorado, and at that time local public health shared some concerns and kind of continued those concerns into the most recent efforts in this last year. So as previously stated by Mac, I guess I'll start with the facts. There is no FDA approved use for Kratom. That is largely because, according to the FDA, there is insufficient clinical evidence that demonstrates that Kratom is safe and that it is able to treat any specific health condition. This is kind of in contrary to how it's often marketed to consumers, and that's a concern. There was a lot of discussion in the prior slides around banning Kratom, which is sort of one side of the argument. The other is sort of how do we ensure that it is safe? And the Kratom industry has also repeatedly failed to meet FDA requirements to legally classify Kratom as a dietary supplement. Local public health officials are really concerned that any regulation will legitimize Kratom and potentially increase sales under a false pretense of government approval and the presumption of safety and effectiveness on the part of the consumer. We can go to the next slide, please. So according to the FDA, there are serious concerns that exist around the toxicity of Kratom in multiple organs. The consumption of Kratom can lead to reports of health impacts, including respiratory depression, vomiting, nervousness, weight loss, and constipation. That's according to the FDA. Kratom has been indicated to have both narcotic and stimulant effects and can potentially cause withdrawal symptoms. So we spoke to a number of, well, actually, let me say this. So we got invited into this conversation by a state senator who was interested. And initially, the Kratom Association shared a very lengthy memo, including many of the research points that Mac had covered originally. And we looked into those, and we also decided that we thought it would be smart to talk to some local experts in Colorado and get their point of view. So we reached out to CDPHE, which conducted some research on Kratom about 2017-18. And we also spoke to some researchers at the University of Colorado. What we learned is, we asked the question, why is the FDA so opposed if this has all these potential benefits? What we were told by a professor of toxicology at the University of Colorado is that Kratom has opioid activity. It's a partial agonist, and so because of the prevalence of opioid challenges and addiction across the United States, there's concerns about a product that has opioid activity. I think that's not to say that the FDA does not believe that more research should be done, or that the experts in Colorado didn't indicate that more research should be done on Kratom. I think there was broad agreement that there could be potential benefit and that we need more research to understand Kratom's safety profile, and particularly, things around dosage and mixing with other drugs. Next slide. So, currently there are few controls on the sale of Kratom across the state. They're pretty easy to access by the general population. And we've heard that because of that, regulation is being proposed as a solution to adulterated products that present a risk to consumers. So as some context, based on national surveys that we think are pretty applicable to Colorado, about 1% to 2% of Coloradans likely use this product. This is somewhat anecdotal, but again, some of the experts that we spoke to said that they believed a much smaller percentage of that number are using it for therapeutic purposes, and there's a chunk of that percentage that are really using it as kind of a recreational drug. So the idea here is that there have been reports of adverse effects when Kratom has been involved, and in some cases death. And as Mac pointed out, there was some research done by CDPHE to look into what was the true cause of those deaths. And I would completely agree with the statement that what we heard from experts was that it was not likely to be Kratom itself, but other drugs in those individuals' systems. However, based on the conversations I participated in, didn't see that there was clear evidence of whether or not that was stemming from individuals themselves mixing the drugs. So often a person who may be trying to recover from some other drug use might be recommended to take Kratom to deal with cravings, and so maybe there's a little bit of a relapse challenge, and that's how they ended up with multiple drugs in the system, versus products that are actually adulterated. So there's not, I don't think, clear evidence of how prevalent the problem of adulterated problems is. And one of the things that we discussed as local public health officials is how and if this regulation or any type of regulation would really solve for that particular issue for consumers. However, we acknowledge that some regulation could provide some basic consumer protections and oversight in terms of people understanding the amount of active ingredient is in the actual product that they're purchasing and using. The other challenge, though, is that without corresponding federal requirements and state and local inspection and enforcement, it's really a measure with limited efficacy, which is why We are glad that the legislation in this past session ended where it did, and that we're now taking a look at what is going to be the real cost and structure to being able to ensure that whatever regulations are put in place are enforced. Next slide. So I do want to acknowledge that, harm reductionists have argued that Kratom provides a really clinical support for people who are recovering from opioid addiction. I think we need to use the utmost caution when taking and evaluating these claims. And our conclusion as local public health officials is that more research is needed to understand these claims and really ensure that we understand what it means to be safe and effective. That being said, anecdotally, there was a lot of testimony at the state capitol last session from individuals. And so we take seriously the idea that without this product, that some individuals would, potentially relapse, or it could lead to an increase in opioid use. So there's definitely both sides. Okay, so next slide. Some of this has already been touched on, but I guess I will just kind of wrap up by saying that when we were originally approached to weigh in on the legislation in its initial sort of regulatory framework, CalFO took an opposed position. We then engaged in a number of conversations about what types of things would need to be included for local public health to really kind of move to a more monitoring approach. Some of them, I think, have already been pretty widely agreed upon and addressed, and that's restricting the sales to 21 plus, ensuring that there's no local preemption so that local governments can regulate Kratom in ways that may exceed any state regulation, requiring clear packaging, labeling, and purity testing. This kind of encompasses a lot of different things around preventing the marketing of this product to kids, making sure packaging is child safe, making sure it's labeled clearly with dosage, and not allowing for health claims that are unsubstantiated. The next bullet is, I know CCI mentioned earlier that there were a lot of concerns from local public health around Kratom being mixed into food or beverage products, either by retail food establishments or by individuals of those in those establishments. So my understanding is Kratom can come in a couple different formats: a liquid, a powder. So someone can take a powder and may put it in a hot beverage. And there were just many concerns by local officials about they are responsible for regulating retail food establishments and wanting to ensure that these regulations we don't get ourselves like sideways about what the responsibilities are of local public health and what's allowed for Kratom sellers. And then local public health was very, very vocal about, if we are going to go down a path of regulation, having adequate monitoring in place to understand what any of the outcomes may be. So, does this increase sales? Does it increase use amongst youth? Any other outcomes, adverse outcomes related to health? We had a lot of conversation about who should be responsible in terms of the agency, Department of Regulation, or Department of Public Health. And I think that's the benefit of where we're at now, is that we're going to have more conversation around how to structure that and how to ensure that local public health officials are not kind of saddled with an unfunded mandate related to Kratom kind of monitoring in retail food establishments. So that's the end of my slides. I do have Jennifer Miles, which is CalFO's lobbyist, is on the call, and so I'm going to ask her if she wants to weigh in on any of anything I said or missed in our kind of journey of getting smart on Kratom.
Thanks, Kara. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Miles. As Kara indicated, I'm a contract lobbyist and I work with CalFO. I thought you did a great job of covering everything and the concerns that we heard from our members and tried to represent during the process. I will just share with folks that the Department of Revenue is now engaging in this process of reviewing this. And the language around stakeholders that can be involved is pretty general. So if you haven't already received information from your association about how to be involved if you want to be directly, I'm sure folks can provide that to you, but it does sound like the staff at CCI and CML are going to be involved. We at CalFO are planning to be involved as well. And so I think just looking forward, we want to be involved in that and see if any further legislation will come forward based on those recommendations, and we plan to continue to work on it. Public health always takes a very data-driven approach and is looking for that data and information about the impact of Kratom on their communities, and that will continue to influence how we address this issue. But besides that, I can't think of anything else to add. Thanks, Kara.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating, the American Kratom Association and the Association of Local Public Health Officials for coming and participating in this. I know we do have a couple of questions that have come in, and if anybody else has additional questions, please just drop them into the chat as we're working through some of these. But McKenna, if you want to start firing off some of those questions, we can get into that section.
Yep, absolutely. So our first question asks, does the Department of Revenue have money allocated for compliance or enforcement for Kratom? And I kind of leave this up to anyone. So
I don't think the legislation has the funding in it, but we support having a registration requirement for Kratom products for which there would be funding then available. Every state's different, and Colorado may have a unique structure. I understood there were some hoops that we had to jump through to make sure that the money that's collected from registrations for Kratom vendors would be appropriately allocated to that, and whatever we need to do to do that, we're fully in support of it. We don't want this to be a burden on taxpayers in any way. The regulation of Kratom in the state of Colorado should be borne by those who benefit economically, which are the vendors, and they should pay for those as long as it's a reasonable enforcement mechanism. I don't think, and this is working in other states. Same is true in Utah, for example, which is a great model with a very robust rulemaking that was done, and it's working effectively, and it is cost neutral to taxpayers.
Real quick, it's my understanding that's going to be part of the feasibility report as well as what the licensing structure will look like, if there is any licensing structure. So that's going to be part of the report.
awesome, thank you. Next question asks, might this product be handled like methadone, not for retail sale?
Well, the truth is the Kratom is not a drug. It is not by chemical origin or genetics in any way an opioid. It is a plant. And so unless it's scheduled, and if the FDA were to require it to go through a new drug application process because it were scheduled, then those would be appropriate restrictions. But right now it is a herbal supplement subject to the requirements for supplement products, which include good manufacturing practices, good testing requirements to make sure they're pure. They certainly wouldn't, it wouldn't be appropriate given the pharmacological activity of Kratom's alkaloids, which are very mild as compared to methadone and other drugs. So it wouldn't be appropriate for them to be treated in that fashion.
Okay. So next one asks, if approved, would it be similar to obtaining a marijuana card or product?
I think, again, real quick, a lot of these questions, and McKenna has sent me a few coming through as far as like who is responsible for doing all this. A lot of this is going to come out through the feasibility report, which I realize is like a terrible response to some of the questions, but that's what part of the study is for Senate Bill 120, is to try and look at what the regulations need to be, or what the state thinks the regulations, or what the state thinks the fiscal implications would be, what they feel like the licensing requirements, if there needs to be any, what they need to look like, what department needs to be over them. That's kind of what Eric went through at the beginning, is what is in that feasibility report. So I know that's kind of an annoying response to keep giving, but that is what that feasibility report looks like, which, like Jennifer said, we will have input on, CCI will have input on. I know CalFO has input on it. I believe American Kratom Association is going to have input on it. It's a very broad stakeholder group that they're asking for input on, to make sure that they are getting all sides of this together to try and come up with an accurate feasibility report for all of this.
And I think it's important to note that whether or not marijuana, the position on marijuana is correct or not, I'm not going to get into, but it is a scheduled substance currently, and it met the threshold for being a scheduled substance. Kratom is not and does not, and so that's the difference. And so the regulatory controls would not be appropriate that are evidenced now by marijuana. However you fall in that argument, that's another area where the FDA probably got it wrong too on marijuana, but that's neither here nor there. The bottom line is Kratom shouldn't be regulated in the same fashion as marijuana under the existing regimen.
So Jacqueline, I'll chime in here too, because I think what I hear also in the question is this a drug? And I am not an expert on Kratom, but I will try and give you sort of the layman's version of what I heard. So we spoke with Dr. Andrew Monti, who's a professor of toxicology at the University of Colorado, and we asked him many of these similar questions. And in the way he explained it to our, and we obviously have a lot of doctors who are local public health officials as well. So, but the way I took it was, this substance it partially binds to the area of, opioid receptors in your brain. And that's what I meant earlier when I said that it has opioid activity, is that there are, there's full binding, like fentanyl, where you get the full effect. And then there are other substances that are used to treat withdrawal from things like fentanyl. And this is sort of on that continuum, farther. It has some activity in your brain that produces pain relief. And because we also asked the question, why would you take this? Well, and the reason is because it gives you a little bit of a buzz and a high. It also supports pain relief. So we heard accounts of people who, had muscle tension and aches and pains, and so they would take Kratom for those reasons. And then obviously the potentially most useful would be for individuals who are trying to deal with really strong craving. So I just want to say that I agree with the statement that this is not a drug like marijuana is a drug, and there are, I guess, specific ways to categorize different types of drugs, and this does not meet that threshold. But there are still some concerns, and I think there are many. What we also heard is that there are many other products that fall into the supplement category, the dietary supplement category, that there are also health concerns about. Like, does this have a long-term impact on your liver and your other organs and things like that? So just because something is a dietary supplement doesn't mean that it's been fully researched and it's safe. So hopefully that's helpful and non-jargony. That was what I walked away with.
So if I could just add one thing, I agree with most of what Kara said. I think that it's important to understand that opioid activity means the binding activity on the mu opioid receptors in the brain does account for what is called opioid activity. Let me tell you the most significant product that the American consumer uses that binds partially to the mu opioid receptors. It's chocolate. And do you know what the second one is? It's cheese. And the reason that pizza is such a popular consumer product is that it gives you pleasure, because cheese binds, the actual alkaloids in cheese bind to the mu opioid receptors. Kratom does that too. Now, it's a partial agonist, meaning it doesn't go to the euphoric high center. Kratom gives you, as a stimulant effect, doesn't give you the buzz like an opioid does, doesn't give you that euphoric reinforcing high. and it doesn't go to your respiratory system in any significant way. So that's the difference. And we can have lots of products that give you that pleasurable effect that increases your mood, elevates your mood, but they're not going to be classified as traditional drugs along the way.
Awesome, thank you. It looks like we have one more question for everyone. So currently, how are underage sales being enforced?
There is no regulation on Kratom until this law goes into effect. We hope that the state will aggressively, through its licensing procedures, enforce much like they do for alcohol and cigarette sales on minors. We don't want minors to have access to Kratom products that they do not use responsibly, because the key here is that consumers should have adequate labeling information with a robust label that describes exactly what's in the product and gives recommended serving sizes, that's appropriate to the package. You could have a large package, and it might be more informative to a consumer to say there are 7 servings in this or 20 servings, as opposed to what a serving size is, where you have to kind of measure it out. But kids should not be in that position of having access to Kratom products that are not going to use them responsibly. But here's the good news about Kratom use with kids. It's just going to make them sick. If you take too much Kratom, you vomit. That's the adverse effect of Kratom. You can't take enough of it in one setting unless it's adulterated. And if it's adulterated, you're going to have all the horrible effects of the adulterant as opposed to Kratom itself. Kratom is self-limiting, and it's probably one of the beauties that the natural plant got right, is that in the alkaloid concentrations in the natural plant, they, in combination like a symphony orchestra, they work. But if you take one and enhance it and you blare the bugle, it ruins the whole symphony. And that's what adulterants do to Kratom.
And McKenna, I had a question when we're done with the other questions. I had a question.
Nope, go ahead and ask yours.
Mr. Haddow, you had mentioned a series of states that have regulatory acts that have been adopted. Can you repeat those again for me?
Sure, I put them in the chat too, but it's Utah was the first state to pass it. And then Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Oregon, and of course, partially Colorado. It passed in the state of Missouri overwhelmingly, and the governor vetoed it. And the reason he vetoed it was that he was told by the FDA that Kratom was federally illegal. Now, whoever at the FDA told the governor that should be fired, because it is not federally illegal. Now, the FDA would like it to be, but they can't project their view on that and claim that it's a law. But the governor has told me that he's going to come back and help us to pass it. So we hope that Missouri will be the next state. And the state of Texas, it passed overwhelming. I think it was 113 to 17 in the House, was on the consent calendar in the Senate when the Texas legislature blew up over the voting rights issue and they adjourned. And they meet every other year. But I've been told that's going to be the next state that does it. It's currently before the Ohio legislature. It passed 82 to 10 in the Ohio House, and it's before the Senate this fall. It's also being considered same fashion in the Senate in Michigan. So we're seeing great progress, and in Pennsylvania, it's currently working its way through the legislative process. So I think we'll have several states will be added this year, and certainly in the coming legislative session, we'll probably have a dozen more that will adopt what's needed, which is a regulatory structure around Kratom so that it is well regulated and these bad actors don't have a free rein to put consumers at risk.
Thanks for that, Liz. I appreciate that.
Awesome. We did have one more question come in while we were discussing. For folks who have not heard of Kratom before this, what do they need to watch for in terms of it being added to things or where it is in gas stations and stores right now? Is there anything else that they need to be aware of?
So if I can make my closing pitch, they should go to kratomanswers.org. That's a brand new website that's been put up, that's been hosted by Drug Policy Alliance, the International Plant and Herbal Alliance, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and the AKA. It is a scientific exposition of the current science and policy on Kratom. It's not an advocacy site, but it gives a lot of information. We recommend people go there to get information about it. And then with respect to adulterated products, you have to treat every Kratom product currently on the market as suspect unless you go to our website and look at the approved GMP manufacturers who have voluntarily submitted to independent third-party audits. and those vendors are certified to be compliant with the standards for a safe Kratom product, and we recommend consumers go there. It is, other than that, it's the Wild West, and people should not be putting themselves at risk by buying these products that are likely adulterated. If someone comes up and says, "Man, that gave me a real high," that's an adulterated product.
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like that's,
Hang on, McKenna. Jennifer, did you want to say
Yeah, I
something?
just wanted to add something for folks to realize or to reinforce. The bill that passed simply required the Department of Revenue to do a study and to produce a report about the regulation of Kratom. In the meantime, there is no regulation except for those communities that Jacqueline mentioned earlier that have passed local ordinances. I would note that local governments can pass their own ordinances in the meantime. What we all anticipate will happen is that this report will come out and it will then result in some kind of legislation. Or if it doesn't, as you heard earlier, there's some regulation that would go into effect automatically. But we anticipate that there may be future legislation based on the outcome of that report that all of our groups would be watching and be involved in. But just want to reinforce that we don't actually have any regulation of this product except for those few communities who have done it on their own at this point in time in Colorado.
awesome, thank you. Well,
And we're looking forward to working with all of you and with the Department of Revenue to find the right regulatory structure to protect consumers.
thank you. Do any of our speakers have any final thoughts before we let everyone go?
I just want to thank everyone for joining us and for our respectful dialogue today. I know that we come from all different corners on this one, so thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate that, for all the educational input on this, and we really do appreciate you coming on and everyone listening, and we look forward to working with you as well moving forward in this feasibility report stakeholder part. So thanks.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for attending as well. We really appreciate it. So just as a reminder, this has been recorded and we will be sending out a link along with the presentation materials. If you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send those back to me and I will make sure that those get to the correct person to get your questions answered. Thank you again to all of our speakers today. We really appreciate your time. So have a good one, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.